in the dust-swept border town of Dry Creek, where the sun blazed red against the jagged mountains and the saloon doors, swung endlessly with cowboys chasing whiskey and regret. The year had dragged itself into a season of hardship, and with hardship came desperate measures. Measures that no woman would have ever dreamed of, enduring in her girlhood when hope was still bright and dreams were still whole. And yet, as the train whistle echoed one last time and the platform emptied, only one bride remained unchosen, standing there like a fragile flower wilting in the desert heat, her pale dress dust-stained, her hands trembling, as she clutched a worn carpet bag that carried everything she owned. Her name was Clara, and Clara's eyes carried a storm, not just from fear of the auction block where the townsmen had gathered to bargain for wives like cattle, but from the ghosts of her past that had followed her all the way from the eastern cities where poverty and betrayal had carved her spirit into something raw and trembling. And as she stood on that wooden stage before the jeers, whistles and bargaining shouts, she felt smaller than the dust swirling at her feet, for all the other brides had been claimed earlier in the day, young women with braided hair and hopeful eyes, handed off to ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners, some smiling nervously, some crying softly, but all chosen, all except Clara and the auctioneer's booming voice. Rough as whiskey and sharp as a branding iron, cut through the dry evening air as he lifted his hand and called for bids, his words echoing with an almost mocking tone as he tried to spark interest in the last bride. The forgotten bride, one more chance, gents. The last lady standing who'll take her hand and give her a home. She can cook, she can sew. She'll warm your hearth through the winter. Who'll start the bidding? And the crowd shuffled, boots scraping against the dirt, men looking at her with narrowed eyes, some laughing, some whispering, some shaking their heads, for Clara was not adorned in silks, nor did she carry the sparkle of hope the others had. Her gown was plain, her shoes worn thin, her beauty shadowed by sorrow, yet there was still something in her eyes, something unbroken beneath the fear, that made her seem more alive than any jewel in a rich man's pocket. And yet still, no hand rose, no bid came, until the silence stretched like a noose around her neck, and Clara felt her knees weakening, felt shame burning hotter than the sun, and she whispered a prayer only her heart could hear, begging God not to abandon her in this place. And just as the auctioneer's voice grew impatient, just as the crowd began to mutter that maybe no one would take her, a voice cracked through the tension like thunder rolling over the canyon, low, steady, carrying a weight that silenced every laugh and murmur. "I'll take her." And from the back of the crowd, pushing through the haze of dust and whiskey breath, stepped a man who looked as though he'd been carved out of hardship itself. His shoulders broad beneath a weathered coat, his hat pulled low to shield eyes that had seen too much, and the limp in his gait told of battles fought and losses endured. His name was Caleb, once a rancher of promise, once a cowboy whose laughter had been known in saloons from Santa Fe to El Paso, but now broken, scarred by grief, for he had lost more than land, more than money. He had lost a wife to sickness, a child to hunger, and though years had passed, the wounds still bled beneath the surface, and men whispered that Caleb had become a ghost in his own skin, living on whiskey and stubbornness. But as he raised his hand, as his voice echoed, the crowd gasped, for no one expected him to claim a bride. No one thought Caleb still had space in his life or his heart for anything but pain. And yet here he was, bidding not with coins of gold but with the raw truth of his presence. And Clara's eyes met his across the dust, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them, something that neither could name, a recognition of brokenness, of survival, of two souls beaten down by life, yet still searching for something worth holding on to. And though the auctioneer laughed nervously, slapping the gavel against the post and declaring the match sealed, though the crowd whispered and muttered about what business Caleb had taking a bride when he could barely keep himself alive, Clara stepped down from that stage, her legs trembling, her heart pounding like a runaway horse. And when Caleb reached out his rough hand, scarred and strong, she placed her own trembling hand in his, not knowing whether she was walking into salvation or ruin, but knowing only that she could not stand on that stage alone any longer. And together they walked through the crowd, past the stairs, past the laughter, toward the horse waiting at the edge of town, and Clara, with her bag clutched against her chest, mounted before him, feeling the solid weight of his arm as he steadied her. And as they rode out beneath the bleeding sky of sunset, the dust rising behind them like a veil to the past, she dared, just for a moment, to believe that maybe, just maybe, this broken cowboy who had raised his hand was not just claiming her out of pity, but because something in her eyes had stirred the last embers of hope in his weary soul. And as the hooves thundered against the hard earth, Clara whispered another prayer. Not of desperation this time, but of fragile hope. And dear listeners, if this story has already pulled you in, if you feel the dust on your skin and the ache in Clara's chest, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Because what lies ahead for Clara and Caleb is not just a marriage, born of desperation, but a battle between broken paths and the possibility of redemption. And I promise you, the story has only just begun. The road out of Dry Creek stretched like a scar across the desert, endless and silent except for the pounding hooves of Caleb's horse and the whisper of wind through the canyons. And as Clara sat before him, her back pressed against the steady wall of his chest, she felt the rhythm of his breathing, deep and heavy, as though every breath cost him more than he had to give, and the weight of his silence pressed against her like the desert heat. For this man, this stranger who had lifted his hand and claimed her when no other would, spoke nothing as they rode, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky burned gold and crimson. And Clara, clutching her worn carpetbag as though it were a shield against the unknown, felt both safe and terrified. For though she had been spared the humiliation of being left behind, she was now bound to a man whose sorrow seemed carved into his bones, a man who bore himself like one who had nothing left to lose. And yet beneath that silence, she thought she caught the faintest flicker of care in the way he steadied her with his arm when the horse stumbled over loose stones, or in the way he slowed the beast's pace as the night fell and the desert air grew sharp and cold. And when at last they reached a lonely homestead, a cabin worn by storms, its roof sagging, its fence broken, its fields dry and begging for rain, Clara realized that Caleb's life was as weathered and battered as his soul. But when he dismounted and held out his hand to help her down, she placed her palm against his without hesitation, for though fear rattled in her chest, there was something steady in his touch that told her she was not stepping into cruelty, only hardship, and hardship she already knew too well. And so the days began, the days where Clara, who had once felt like the world had cast her aside, now found herself cooking simple meals in a rough-hewn kitchen, mending Caleb's torn shirts by the dim glow of lantern light, drawing water from the well that groaned as though it carried the weight of generations. And each night she lay awake on a narrow bed, listening to the lonely creak of the house and the heavy footsteps of the cowboy who had become her husband not by love but by necessity. And yet, as the weeks turned into months, something began to shift like the first green shoots after a long winter. For Clara, with her gentle hands and quiet determination, breathed life into the cabin, sweeping dust from corners, planting seeds in the dry soil, humming soft songs from her childhood as she worked. And Caleb, though still quiet, still burdened by shadows, began to watch her in ways he had not allowed himself to watch another soul in years, catching the light in her hair as the sun rose over the fields, listening to the way her voice softened the silence, feeling something stirring within him that he thought had long since died. And yet, with every flicker of warmth came a battle, for Caleb's heart was chained to grief, haunted by the faces of those he had lost. And many nights, Clara would wake to find him outside, staring at the stars, a bottle half empty at his feet, his shoulders bowed as though the heavens themselves pressed down upon him. And though she longed to reach for him, to tell him that sorrow shared was sorrow halved, she held back, afraid to press too hard against wounds that still bled, until one night, as the storm winds howled across the plains and the roof rattled with rain, she found him sitting alone by the dying fire, his head in his hands, his breath ragged, and she, trembling yet resolute, knelt before him, taking his calloused hands in her own, whispering words that rose from the deepest place in her spirit. "You don't have to carry it alone, Caleb. You don't have to be broken forever." And in that moment, the walls he had built cracked, his eyes lifting to hers, filled with tears that had been buried too long, and he let out a sound that was half a cry, half a laugh, as though he could not decide whether to mourn or to hope. And for the first time in years, Caleb allowed another human being to see him as he truly was, shattered yet still alive. And Clara, with her fragile strength, did not turn away. And that night, as the storm raged outside, something unspoken bound them together. Not yet love, not yet joy, but the first fragile step toward healing. And the days that followed grew softer, The silence is less heavy, the meals shared with small smiles, and slowly, ever so slowly, laughter returned to the cabin, first in small bursts, then in longer waves, until one afternoon, as Clara chased a runaway chicken across the yard, Caleb stood at the doorway, watching her with a smile he had thought lost forever, and in his chest, hope burned like the sun cresting over the mountains. And listeners, I want you to feel this moment, this fragile rebirth, of two souls who had been cast aside by the world yet found each other in the dust. And if you want to walk with them further, through the trials that still await, through the enemies who will rise, through the sacrifices that will test their bond, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, because Clara and Caleb's story is not only about survival, it is about redemption, about discovering that even the most broken cowboy can find a reason to raise his hand when the world least expects it, and that sometimes the last bride left standing is the one destined to bring a man back from the edge of despair. And dear friend, this chapter may close, but their journey has only just begun.